Before we start this week, I have a question for you. Have you ever walked out of a treatment room thinking there has to be a better way to help people in pain? If you felt the frustration of cycling through short-term fixes, if you're tired of care that feels disconnected, disempowering, or just not enough, Pain Practice OS was made for you. It's a complete, ready-to-use system that helps you deliver powerful, person-centered pain programs one-on-one or in groups. It gives you the clinical tools, the session structure, the marketing strategy, and the financial model to finally do this work in a way that's effective, sustainable, and deeply meaningful. You don't have to go it alone. With built-in cohort support, mentoring, and guidance every step of the way, you'll have what you need to bring real change to your practice and hope to the people you serve. If that speaks to you, go to modernpaincare.com/pain program and jump on our waiting list so you can be the first to know when the program launches. Now, on to today's episode.
A whole body of research demonstrating that the social environment, the social milieu that we find ourselves in co-regulates inflammation. So just by changing social environments can change inflammatory states in the body.
That is Matt Erb, someone who's not only changed the way I think about mind-body care, but who's also doing the real work of bridging physiology, psychology, and social context into clinical practice. This episode is for every clinician who's ever asked me, how do I actually bill for this? How do I document nervous system regulation, breath work, or trauma-informed care in a system that's built for sets, reps, and manual therapy? Matt and I unpack all of that today. We'll walk through how to frame and code this work with the current system, ethically, legally, and effectively, while keeping your care aligned with a truly whole person model. If you've ever felt stuck between what you know patients need and what your EMR wants you to write, this episode will give you clarity, confidence, and practical tools to move forward. We'll also cover how to interview from a trauma-informed lens, how to navigate the trap of reductionism, and what it really means to support healing through presence, physiology, and empowerment. Let's get into it.
This is the Modern Pain Podcast with Mark Cardula.
Matt, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Good to see you, Mark.
It's always good to have a conversation with Matt. Matt is somebody who's really had a big influence on my career, really, as far as broadening my viewpoint on mind-body medicine. We'll talk about, if those of you who've listened to episodes back, ways back, Matt came on and talked a little bit of his work. We have a paper he authored that I think is great, and we'll link it in the show notes. He's going to discuss a little bit of that. That just gets into the mental health and really integrating that into physiotherapy care. But Matt, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the stimulus for that paper, as far as you've been in the physical therapy field for a bit now, and you've seen things evolve and maybe a lack of evolving that may have stimulated the paper. What if you can discuss a little bit about what stimulated your writing of that paper?
The paper really has arisen out of my entire career, 27 years in now, with a passion for mind-body integration. I don't know how many years ago when I first came across the World Physiotherapy's subgroup, the International Organization for Physiotherapy and Mental Health, I thought, why isn't the U.S. engaged in that, seeing how much more developed it was in a number of European and Eastern countries? And of course, we are now. Several of us got together, Ellen Anderson and I, and a number of others, Marlisa Sullivan, and helped the APTA officially join that group a few years ago. And it's a loosely organized group, but out of that and some invitations to speak at the Latin American Conference on Physiotherapy and Mental Health Care, I was invited to consider putting my presentation into a paper, and that's the result.
And it's a great paper that kind of gets into some of the issues we've had as a profession of true integration. Where would you see, because I think you've put some rightful criticisms about maybe some fragmentation versus truly embodying a whole person way of getting it. Where do you feel this paper kind of tugs at some of those issues we've had with maybe biopsychosocial versus a more integrated, truly integrated whole person approach?
Yeah, I think that the reductionism is so entrenched in our training in general and biomedical. One of the things I like to start with on this topic is that there's a tendency to think that the psychological domain of our life and or the social domain are not represented by neurophysiological or biological correlates. And there are, in fact, underpinnings. So just the three words unto itself is implying that they're three separate things. And I know there's been a lot of publications on this area. But when you look at things like, I can't remember if I referenced it in the paper, but Naomi Eisenberger's work out of UCSF, she's done a whole body of research demonstrating that the social environment, the social milieu that we find ourselves in co-regulates inflammation. So just by changing social environments can change inflammatory states in the body. We tend to go immediately towards, what are you eating? And of course, that's important because we know that ultra processed foods is a major source of inflammation in our system with the gut-brain axis. But we don't often tend to look at the environments that people are bathed in. And so the social environment as one thing. And then we each, of course, have the individual mind-body connection, which is our individual psychology, our personality. But all of that also is found to have biological underpinnings. And so just that alone, helping people to understand not to distinguish the biological or biomedical domain from the social and psychological elements, psychosocial stressors, for example, of people's lives, is something I say over and over to help people change their thinking about the relevance of that.
I love how you connected the neurophysiology to it, right? I think there's this thought that there's this nebulous factor out there of social, and when you can really put it into biology, where we embody our social world, like you said, the social world we're bathed in, and that context that we operate in that have constant influence on how our systems are regulating or dysregulating. I don't want to get too deep into this topic because it gets a little contentious but this thought, there's still folks that think there's going to be some biomedical breakthrough that's just going to, and if we just can learn to, and the new thing seems to be the nociceptive apparatus, where it's just this biological island that it just, I'm probably misrepresenting a little bit, but it still seems to me like we're still looking, there's certain pockets, and I've had discussions with various clinicians who, and that's okay. They can have disagreements. I think that's healthy. But where do you sit with this thought on this like nociceptive apparatus, and that it's just a matter of a biomedical breakthrough that's going to really, really unlock some improvements in pain? Do you think we're missing a biomedical breakthrough, or are we still just missing the big picture as it comes to pain?
I will remain ever hopeful that the biomedical model can come up with breakthroughs that alleviate suffering, that alleviate the experience of pain. I think that I tend to take the non-dual approach of both and. So when we look at pain reprocessing therapy and this messaging that it's a relatively or entirely produced by the brain, and so changing brain structures through psychological processes, through mental, cognitive, emotional awareness and expression is the solution, I don't negate that or distinguish it from the research that's showing that if you have chronic non-diffuse or non-specific low back pain, that there may be non-identifiable on structural imaging, but neuroimmune and neuroinflammatory and cellular changes that are activating it. But I don't make a distinction that if that's the case, that negates the relevance of offloading the allostatic load, psychosocial stress, addressing upstream determinants to their health, and so on. I see that it's a both and for me, of addressing the tissues, the health of the tissues locally, and addressing the neural networks that communicate from the tissues of the body to the brain simultaneously.
And it's great points you bring up, because I do think sometimes we tend to jump to the or approach with things. And there's definitely been my experience with some of the pain science things early on where I jumped way into the psychosocial without recognizing the interplay of biology. And that, like you said, let's definitely hold hope for biomedicine to have some breakthroughs that can ease suffering and help people out. But we also need to understand the biology, the connection of the psychosocial in our biology we can, to me, treat it all and maximize all aspects of things instead of just trying to segment people into categories. Now, in your paper, you highlighted the mind-body medicine approach as part of your framework, which you've done some great work and really worked with some pretty impressive groups and folks with that. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what the mind-body medicine kind of approach looks like in a practical day-to-day physical therapy setting, as far as how does that look like day-to-day, maybe how your average day caseload might interact with that, because I know it can probably vary depending on the person in front of you. But I think sometimes physios hear mind-body medicine and they don't really have a view on what does that look like. And obviously you don't have to get into the exact details of detailed intervention strategies, but maybe how that looks in just a day-to-day approach.
I think it starts out of the gates with a psychosocial oriented interview that is also trauma informed. So I think what is smart and safe in terms of developing a relationship, knowing that the populace is just as entrenched in the splitting of mental health, psychological, social factors from what's happening in their body. And so questions, just give me a little bit of a sense. I'll preface it with one line education. We know that high stress can increase inflammation, can predispose us to all kinds of ill health issues. So I'm wondering if you could give me a sense if you feel like your stress levels, whether it's social or occupational, are they low, medium, or high of late? So questions like that, or I'll ask questions like, even if you don't think it has anything to do with the problem you're here for, and I'll say to you right away that I don't make any assumptions about relative causality, but I'd like to get to know a little bit about what your body and your nervous system has been through. Any history of any accidents, injuries, or traumas, even if they're not physical traumas, psychological. So I might ask a question like that. And of course, it's pretty easy in my practice because most people are referred knowing that they're coming to a mind-body integrated whole person practice. Many of them are referred by mental health professionals because they have co-occurring anxiety, depression, diagnosed PTSD or trauma history. So it's easier for me in that setting than I think the average practitioner, but there's ways with simple education to begin to open the conversation about stress as a pretty safe entry point for most people.
I would agree. I don't think stress is something that's very taboo per se. Now, your practice is, well, when you're working with some of these people, interventional strategies, obviously you're talking assessment and some of the great things we do to peel away the layers of all the things that are surrounding maybe what comes in as a script as a low back pain thing, where we often try to obviously get to know a little bit more of the whole person thing. What kind of like interventional strategies? I know there's variety depending on the person in front of us, but I wonder if you could discuss a little bit of how maybe trauma-informed care and a little bit more of how mind-body medicine looks in the day-to-day, like as far as some interventional strategies, what kind of interventions you might be using, and that you think as physios, we should be more comfortable at least delving into that to best serve our patients.
I'll start just with an example of trauma-informed care. The provision of choice is critical. I can't cite the author off the top of my head, but I know when I was first studying this, I can say that there's research around 2 to 3 choices supports, I'm going to call it the biology of empowerment. Too many choices will overwhelm, but just automatically assuming this is what we're going to do without providing some options for choice is an example of helping support a sense of autonomy or agency within the care experience. And I consider that part of trauma-informed care. When I look at the broad field of mind-body medicine, which is really built off psychoneuroimmunology, or as Candace Pert, the person who discovered the mu receptor, said, psychoneuroendoimmuno, keep adding it in because really we do function as whole state, whole system patterning. And that's why I put a lot of emphasis in mind-body medicine on nervous system regulation. I try to get some basic assessment out of the gates. For example, I'll take a look at hand and foot temperatures. Colder hands and colder feet generally indicate higher sympathetic dominance. I'll take a look at a heart power spectrum analysis and heart rate variability to get a little bit of a sense of the autonomic profile as is acting on heart rate variability. Most of the time in an initial evaluation with the population I'm working with, and I guess most people coming to a health care appointment, there's high sympathetic dominance in the heart rate variability pattern. And so I begin to look at my sense of how regulated, physiological regulated, what's the arousal or activation level? Is this person in a state of hypervigilance? And I'll start to work with guided mind-body practices that build on body awareness, breath awareness, breath regulation, neurocognitive principles that arise out of mindfulness and like somato-emotional awareness. How does this pain experience make you feel? And I'm asking that not because I'm suggesting it's causing your pain, but I'd like to get a sense of the impact this is having on your life. Does it bring up frustration or sadness, or these types of questions provide permission to, as an entry point into the whole that each person really is, And a lot of people are surprised by it. I had worked with someone recently and I asked a question about similar to that, and tears pretty quickly. And I said, what's happening? And the response was grief. I've lost so much since this started in my life. And then I said, and I acknowledge grief is probably one of the most under-recognized aspects of living with chronic pain, more tears. So it's just simple acknowledgments. It's how you relate. It's how you respond. It's how you preface it. And then weave in practices that I use the analogy of a radio dial. So as your nervous system, central autonomic axis together dialed up in arousal. Ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that? Things are more biased to be interpreted as faux or unpleasant or novel. Pay attention, right? There's a vigilance baseline. And then I teach people how to dial that back down. And you'd be amazed when this becomes the focus of what you're looking for, how people will experience a physiological shift and automatically they're demonstrating shifts in committed actions, cognitive framework. The behavioral set widens naturally without me having to do any sort of lifestyle or motivational interviewing or suggestions for home program. It's what's your committed action? What's your takeaway from today? It's not me telling them what it should be, but that opens up when I can help them through co-regulation. So the regulation of myself, the training of self-regulation, physiological self-regulation skills. So I went on for a while, but
that was great. I think I love because you exuded it. You just demonstrated it. It's very much a more Socratic guided discovery process with these type of approaches. It's not, we just had a podcast episode on this topic of how we have this struggle as PTs. We want to grab the steering wheel and drive it in a direction, and we don't open up that self-discovery process, like you said, where I think it's fascinating that you've seen patients where when you open the door to this physiologic change, that it just opens up the door. I've really gotten in the habit of helping people do a mindfulness activity just to learn that right off the bat, just to start kind of calming the system down. I maybe haven't used the exact thought process or terminology you use, but I've definitely found it much more easy to have them start opening discussions and moving in areas and being able to like maybe work when you start helping them regulate things. But I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the communication skills that are involved in kind of that guided discovery approach. Instead of to me, it's you're not giving them the answers, but you're helping them come up with their own answers, not just telling them the answer of the question. Would that be accurate? Or how do you view kind of your communication approach when you're trying to help people maybe connect the dots with some of this stuff?
I'll start with the phrase phenomenological heuristic, which I get criticized for daily for using in my household. No one knows what that is. It's enabling people to come to know themselves better and to arrive at their own answers and decisions. So it's really a subjective based approach, and to not go into it with assumptions. And the work that I've done with this nonprofit in Washington, D.C., we do a wide range of mind-body skills like simple drawings. So I'll give you an example. Draw yourself with your biggest problem. Crayons, piece of paper, what comes out. I did a group when I was first getting certified in this with chronic pain and chronic migraine and headache patients at the hospital I worked at in Minneapolis back in 2009, I think. And we did this with all of them. And probably only half of them drew their biggest problem as their pain, even though they signed up as chronic or persistent pain patients. So that alone gives you a sense that there's more going on here, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of open-ended questions, tell me more, I'm curious about. I do a lot of observation. So when someone's telling me their history, I try to watch body language. And if I notice a shift based on something that's said, I may make a comment like, anything you notice happening in your body as you're just telling me about that? So they're getting real-time cues to tune in to the mind-body connection because they may be cognitively fused, if ACT, right, cognitive fusion with the storyline about the accident, but they're not aware that even just relaying it to me is dialing up that arousal level. So I try to be really cautious about not invading someone's unconscious, but they're open-ended questions that facilitate that present moment attention on what's happening physiologically in the body when they're sharing or processing something that's more cognitive.
It gets into, I've been diving a little bit into this whole default mode network of that humans operate under, where it's just this kind of neurophysiologic kind of, I guess, the soundtrack that plays. And sometimes we get so ingrained and identified, like you said, fused to this mind track of what it is and how we identify ourselves, and almost sometimes identify ourselves so deeply with past experience or the pain and all that's come around it, that it's having the skills to have somebody almost step back from that experience and look at it from almost like an outside perspective, which is a lot what ACT and mindfulness does, is to help people be, instead of ruminating or future past kind of mindset, where they can come into the now and stuff. And I've been just amazed how that has been so helpful for people, and completely agree. I've seen people where I notice sweating, and I notice like just body posture and things changing when they're starting to go over some of these tough situations and stories. Obviously emotions, like you mentioned with your patient there, coming out as well. One thing I wanted to make sure we touched on too, and this discussion of the framework to this whole person support, and one of the components of it you discussed is this capacity to be present, to learn from discomfort. And to me, that is so hard, I think, and I know it was for me. I understand, I think about it. I'm going to have you get deeper into it. But there's this, and it could be cultural too, I'm sure it is cultural, where like pain is something not to be experienced and we have to eradicate and escape it at all costs. Yet when we look at life, it's probably an inescapable reality of the human condition. We're going to bump into some of these things. I'm wondering if you could speak to what you mean by that capacity to be present and learn from discomfort, and how you might help a patient kind of explore that with themselves.
That's a big one. A few weeks ago, I gave a presentation at the University of Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine. It's a subsidiary of the College of Medicine, but it's funded by the Andrew Weil Center, on just introduction and overview to persistent pain, pain biology, integrative care for pain. And I put up a graphic showing the rates of chronic pain around the world based by country. And the top 3 countries with the highest rates of reported chronic pain are the UK, Australia, and the United States. And I present the question to the audience, what do you all think might be behind that? And I get a lot of different, very interesting answers, some of which have led me into new avenues of insight. But in the end, I often will say, I wonder at a sociocultural level that we have cultivated a society with a very low tolerance for unpleasant of anything. We want it fixed. We don't want to be bothered. There's this sort of, and I usually get mostly nods around that. I sometimes, when I talk about sociocultural phenomena, talk about a series of 3 papers and about whiplash, for example. And there was a paper looking at the concept of whiplash in Lithuania versus in Norway. And in Norway, they have whiplash support groups all around the country. But in Lithuania, they don't really have an equivalency to the idea, and the rates of people seeking care for neck pain or headache are much lower. And the idea is that we have collective beliefs. We have individual beliefs, but there's collective or societal beliefs that are drivers to what we experience. And so comfort with discomfort for me is just helping people temper that. So it can start really simply with notice the area of pain. I'll get people lying down, get them as relatively comfortable as they can be. Bring your attention to it. And I call it self-regulation in the face of pain. And I'll say this supports natural resilience, that you're not going anywhere and I'm not going anywhere, at least not in this moment. So can I dial down some of the outputs that come with the pain experience, that protection? Can you notice some subtle holding or guarding, either locally in the area of the pain, or maybe it's upstream? You might be clenching your jaw and you got shoulder earrings on, but the pain is in your back. Can you disarm that? Can you drop the shoulders? Can you unclench the jaw? Can you stop holding the breath? And I'll say, this is what I mean by beginning to develop a greater degree of comfort with discomfort. And I'll say, this will build on your natural resilience. You're already resilient because you wouldn't be here living with, 6 years of chronic back pain. And we want to deepen what that means and give you a skill set that takes you deeper into the capacity to not add to the harm, because I talk about it being a negative feedback loop, that if you don't disarm that secondary protection, it reinforces a negative pattern generator of sorts. So give you a little bit of a sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. I just had a patient today. She's got hypermobility syndromes, but she's also got some kind of comorbid issues. And she's also come with a very litany of not the most confidence building messages she's gotten about her body, she's been to clinicians who are very much, you're slipping in and out of place and all pain means all these different things. And we did just very much a similar thing of having her do a body scan and recognizing like tensionaries and things like that. And it was amazing. Like after she was like, oh my God, like it was like this massive shift. And she had a big light bulb moment of we got a lot more work to unpack because I think she doesn't recognize some of the things she's fused to. And I think we'll try to do some exercises to help her kind of recognize how some of the narratives she's gotten pretty ingrained in her belief system might not be helping her move in a situation. But no, I love that. And I completely agree. I think I'm on board with your thoughts on societally, kind of social culturally, we've created a lack of ability to tolerate any inconvenience or uncertainty or unpleasantness. It needs to all be sunshines and rainbows, which would be nice if it was that way, if the world was that way. But I think those of us who have experienced our own shares of pain and discomfort and challenge. But with that said, one of the parts of your paper discussed the social determinants of health. And I think that's a huge topic and one that gets where I see healthcare systems, our healthcare system, we have our social determinants of health screening. And I wonder where you think we are in general. I'm sure you're doing probably a little bit more, but I think there's lip service paid to social determinants of health at the moment. But what do you feel like if we were to really, this probably takes more than just what's going to happen in our clinic, right? This takes policy, all sorts of governmental things, societal change and different things like that. But I'm wondering how you look at social determinant of health, of how you can measure and impact it in your own practice.
Yeah, it's a really big, important issue for me in my work. I think you're right. We give a lot of lip service, but then we don't know what to actually practically do with it. I do think we need some engagement in policy and advocacy. In the chapter in the textbook that I co-created with Arlene Schmid, she's an OT researcher at Colorado State. The chapter was written by Todd Davenport. He's the program director at Pacific University, and Andra DeVote, who's got a master's of public health. She's in private practice on Vashon Island outside Seattle. But they co-wrote this chapter and they laid out a whole set of things that practices, individuals, like a layered model of how you can support this topic, from your business model to policy and advocacy to getting involved in community networks and so on. So people can reference that if they're interested. I'm happy to answer questions outside of this if people want more ideas there. I think that I'll just say this. Every year for the last 9 years, I've led a 10-week-long mind-body skills group, which is a standardized evidence-based model. And I lead it for the first-year psychiatry residents coming into residency here at the university. We have a paper published on the impact of that on their residency in Academic Psychiatry Journal. And one of the things I say to them right out of the gates is I said, if you think that this is in your curriculum as another corporate wellness program, think again. I said, if you experience burnout in your residency, it's not a personal moral failing. You're working in a broken and sometimes toxic system, and just offloading some of that agency if you're struggling so you don't internalize what's wrong with me. We then, when that is happening unconsciously, we then try to put it back on, take another yoga class or go to mindfulness or that sort of thing. In the clinic, where I'm going with this is that acknowledging the impact of the toxic environments that people might be living and working in on their health helps redistribute a sense of agency. Then I try to take it further into helping people. I'll say something along the lines of, and we still are left with how do we relate and respond in each moment, because change at the level we want it at in the upstream determinants of health is excruciatingly slow. So I do want to help you arrive at the best possible choices within your current situation, scenario, so you can relate and respond as effectively, as efficiently as you can. So we're not adding stress into the mix. So that type of educational, lingo, permission to offload some of it so they don't go into the shame, blame, stigma that comes along with all mental health, really. But even if they don't have a mental health challenge, it's just the nature of psychosocial stressors and these upstream determinants.
It's good to see folks that are looking at this. I think, as I mentioned, and you confirmed, like the lip service we pay to it, I think is one thing. And I just think we still have healthcare systems. To find a social worker, if you're in a hospital system, it's great, but to have somebody really plug somebody into resources, but also recognize when people are coming in with these factors and how these toxic environments and the other parts of the social determinants of health are really stacked against somebody. It's hard when you bring them into this world of this sterile, comforting, soothing, supportive environment, yet you send them out into a society where they don't have a lot of resources working in their favor. I think we can do a better job to just maybe look big. And it's probably big picture stuff too, like you said, policy, different things in advocacy, which are hugely important, yet massively frustrating at the same time, just because the pace of change, and sometimes change goes in the wrong direction, as we can see sometimes here in the US. But you mentioned in your answer a little bit in that chapter how Todd and the author discussed the business aspects. And that's a constant question I receive from clinicians. And I know you've taught about this and you have resources on this. So definitely follow up with Matt and pick his brain about it. But we're going to pick his brain right now. The ability to deliver this type of care, there's always this thought of, if I'm not billing manual therapy and therapeutic exercise, I don't know what to do. And folks feel lost I want to provide this care. I can see its value, yet I have a supervisor who's breathing down my neck. It needs to be billable and reimbursable. How do you approach it? And how do you look at billing this, setting it up? Because we do have some systemic issues when it comes to how we have to categorize and all this different things. But I'm wondering how you manage the system that we're stuck within and still be able to provide good care that abides by some of the challenges we have from a revenue and kind of financial demands of a practice.
I'm a self-proclaimed linguist. The play on words, I think when you have the right wording, it actually isn't that hard to fit in the type of practice I do into the box. Neuromuscular reeducation, if you look at psychoneuroimmunology and this idea of nervous system regulation, it's system-wide effects. So let's say I can bring down sympathetic dominance, I can increase parasympathetic dominance, and maybe I can shift central correlates. I don't do as much of it now because of logistical issues, but EEG neurofeedback, EEG guided biofeedback of brainwave patterns, when you create that shift, you're going to see other layered shifts across systems, including decreased muscle tone. So for me, the concept of neuromuscular reeducation goes far beyond just that I'm uptraining a quad after a knee surgery sort of type of scenario. I'll give you an example, and I pulled this deliberately from a recent note. Worked predominantly on physiological quieting and nervous system regulation, including central/autonomic state regulation using evidence-based mind-body medicine skills training in tandem with light touch sensory modulation techniques. Cues on local tension reduction, but also regional protection. So this type of language, and I build that under neuromuscular re-ed. I also put reinforced cognitive, emotional strength and resilience building tools throughout. So this sort of language. I do a lot of physiological self-regulation training. So I'll say physiological regulation training using breath awareness and breath control, body awareness cues, conscious relaxation skills training. And then I use things like autogenics, which is evidence-based, or thermal biofeedback, where I'm monitoring hand temperature, or I'm getting a recording of heart rate variability, or I'm using data from their own Apple Watch or their Fitbit. I got a lot of people with POTS, and they have the Tachymon, for example, which helps them monitor their heart rate. I had someone recently, actually just this week on Monday, the lowest resting heart rate I've seen since I started working with this person with long COVID, but it dropped to 66 during the session. Those are just a few examples.
Yeah. And like you said, I think there's the research in the physiology behind this stuff, if easily can fit within neuromuscular reeducation for a good component of it. Are there any other codes or building codes? I know for those of you who aren't in the US, you're gonna be like, what are you guys talking about neuromuscular reeducation? But just bear with us for a little bit. There might be some similar ways that things are billed or charged away from the good old US. But anything else you use besides that, or is that the majority of how you're
So I do a lot of contemplative movement practices. So I weave in principles of therapeutic yoga and qigong. I use a mindfulness applied to movement, which is a model that I created. So I'll use therapeutic exercise. I'll say education on rationale and effects of therapeutic or medical based aspects of key postural, positional, or therapeutic yoga exercises or qigong, this sort of thing. I use self-care home management and ADL training, 97535 for those in the US. Therapeutic activities. Sometimes I'll use mind-body approach of functional postural retraining with integration of understanding one's body language, posture, and stress interactions. Things like that. I use sensory integration codes when I'm doing stuff that's more sensory experiencing, somato-emotional integration, sensory processing type work. Let's see, what else? Even therapy, sometimes I will adapt manual therapy if I'm using it to reflect that I'm using it specifically to reduce tissue tone, resting state tension, like neuromodulation, sensory modulation. And I go back and forth between whether I put part of it under manual or part of it under neuro. I've never had any documentation questioned or challenged in my 27-year career that I'm aware of, but it's never been brought to my attention by any of my employers or billing agencies.
And I got to imagine just that there would have been some attention given if there was any issues with it. And yeah, it all seems extremely logical. And we're going to try to put together some resources for clinicians in our program too. And I'll probably be bothering Matt as well to see if he can share some of these, because I think they're great and they really go to just phrasing things. And we're not trying to do some sort of nebulous sneaking it into this. It all makes complete physiological, logical, and most importantly, legal sense when it comes to following the letter of our policies and procedures. Before we finish up today, and thank you for that, by the way, but one of the topics that, and we've had Joe Tad on and he speaks to salutogenesis, but I wonder if you could talk about principles of salutogenesis and eudaimonia, how it applies in your framework and whole person support that you discussed in the paper. I think some folks aren't really maybe well-versed with the terminology. I think probably a good portion of our listeners are, but some not so much, and how you kind of look at those as components of that framework.
Yeah, it's fresh on my mind because I was just earlier, I got an invitation to the Frontiers in Public Health, producing a paper on the intersection of salutogenesis or salutogenic models in indigenous communities. And I have lived and worked in indigenous communities since 1999. So that's an area that's near and dear to my heart and my work. I see it very similar actually to the way that I see aspects of the ACT model. So when you look at values-based living, continue to take committed actions in the service of one's values, I see that as aligned with this concept of purpose and meaning and health and healing. So I really open the door to helping people better identify what their values and intentions are, what's meaningful to them, like the batteries exercise and ACT models. What do you plug into to derive a sense of meaning? And how does that inform how you're moving ahead with your rehab, how you relate and respond to your condition? I remember the first time I read the World Health Organization's definition of well-being, and it said, a state that can be experienced independent of the presence or absence of an illness, injury, or disease. I thought, wow, is that foreign to my culture?
Yeah.
But it's helping people with frameworks. And I tend to use what I call an embodied model of action. So it's ACT and mind-body medicine together, and then open the door so that it's self-defined what that means. And then I bring in a lot of wisdom tradition teachings. So I'll say things like, I don't know if you've ever heard this old teaching, but suffering comes equally. It's two sides of the same coin. So the attachment, oh, this feels good, more of this, please, as it does, because as soon as it's gone, you suffer. as it does from saying, oh, no, I can't have this experience. Or these ideas like what you resist is more apt to persist. Some of these types of sayings can echo and resonate with people. I'll give you one last example. I'll have people get into body awareness state and I'll say, see if any of the following messages land. Ultimately, I'm safe and strong in the flow of my life and of spirit. And this word spirit might scare some people away, but it's very secular, non-religious sort of framework. Or what's it like to release myself from any unrealistic expectations that are being placed upon me, others, or the world around me? But I have people looking for a bodily response. And then I say, if these messages don't resonate, what is your own message where you can actually feel a shift in your body? And that's often the way into what facilitates Eudaimonia or the salutogenic type principle, that you can cultivate a greater degree of well-being and live well, relatively well, despite the presence of the problem.
Yeah. And that's the whole crux of ACT too, is to be able to manage, to not turn away and look away from difficult experience, to be able to live well with difficult experience, discomfort, pain, difficult emotions, whatever it may be that's showing up for the person. So I love that kind of nuanced view of it with a little bit of your expertise in the mind-body world. So Matt, I could talk to you for probably another hour, and I'm going to be bothering you to continue to see if we can get you to participate in some of our work. We're in the process of drawing up a community to support our cohort course that's going to be helping people start developing these programs in their practice. And I'm going to bother Matt and put him on the spot. He doesn't have to accept here now and then, but we're going to see if we can get him in as one of our experts that comes in regularly, because I think having him to lean on when you're trying to incorporate some of this stuff in your practice, and to be able to, when you're in the midst of struggling with patients, that's what the whole community part is, to be able to get some advice from some seasoned experts. Matt, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for the time you gave today, and we got to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate what you're doing. It's an honor to be here with you. So more will come.
Yes, absolutely. And for those of you listening, if anybody you know could benefit from this episode, they're struggling figuring out how to build this type of care, or they are just looking at how we can better incorporate mental health, we will link Matt's paper, Matt's textbook. I almost walked away here to my bookshelf because it's right behind me on the bookshelf. It's a great book. We'll link that in the show notes as well. He's got a lot of amazing authors that contributed to that I still peel that book out, just looking for some resources and references as far as really holistic whole person care. And we'll link some of the other papers that Matt's been involved in and his contact information. If you ever want to reach out to Matt, we'll make sure we have his contact information in the show notes as well, so you can reach out to him. We will leave it there this week. Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I am going to add one thing, just because we're talking about social determinants, but I've made it very clear from the start, and proceeds on books are very small, but any proceeds actually do go to my own sliding fee and pro bono mentoring program. So I actually, half the people in my current online mind-body skills group are from underserved communities and have scholarships. So I turn any proceeds around from professional activities back into that. And that's the type of thing that practices, I think, sometimes can do or look at doing as ways to serve people who otherwise can't access the resources.
Yes, and I will probably be leaning on you so we can incorporate a similar model in our work to see if we can help clinicians better be able to, especially in underserved communities. There's just so much that I think we can do to give back in communities that need some of these mind-body skills to navigate some of the difficult contexts that surround them. So thank you so much for that work you're doing, and we look forward to hearing more about it as we bother you to come on this show again, hopefully not in the too distant future. We will leave it there this week. For those of you listening, make sure you share this episode and subscribe wherever you're listening, and we'll talk to you all next week.